Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Jimenez, and welcome to part two of APA Foundations. In the previous section, we talked a little bit about what APA is, what it's used for, why we use it in terms of avoiding plagiarism. We talked a little bit about examples of what constitutes plagiarism. In this section, we're going to talk a little bit about how to cite and some of the guidelines that have been put forth by the APA publication manual. And for the purposes of this course, and for the remainder of this course, the edition that we are using as our guideline when it comes to APA is in the form of the 6th edition of the APA publication manual. The reason I'm making a big deal about this is because sometime in late October and early November 2019, we will see, in this case, the release of the 7th edition of this manual. And it's not fair for you to have to go back and now buy another book and figure it out. But if you are using this publication manual, the 6th edition, we're still going to use it for this course. If you don't have the book, you can go onto the Purdue OWL, which you'll see links of in our APA folder in Blackboard, and you'll be able to access some guidelines as well. But the point of this is we are using the guidelines and rules from the 6th edition, and that's what we will be using for the purposes of this course. So with that, let's talk a little bit about how to cite. When it comes to citations or inline citations, there's really two kinds. The first one is what we call a signal phrase. A signal phrase simply just means that you have a citation that appears at the beginning of your sentence that you're giving credit to. Again, the reason that we are citing is to give credit to the author who came up with an idea. So in this case, the author happens to be Jones, and they wrote some sort of work in 1998, or it was published in 1998. And here is the direct quote. All direct quotes, as you'll notice, will have, in this case, quotation marks from beginning to end. So you have your entire sentence that you are quoting surrounded by these quotation marks. And then you'll put the page number. Notice that the page number is in parentheses, and it has, you don't put PG, just put P followed by a period and then the page number. You'll also notice, and this is something that I've seen students get tripped up on sometimes, is that when you are putting a citation in a sentence, the citation goes inside of the sentence, and then the period goes at the very end of the citations. Notice that there's no period at the end of the quote. It's at the end of the citation. So everything goes in together. You put a period at the end, and this way I know that when I read this entire sentence, from the first word down to the period, I know that here's the author, here's the year, here's the quote, and this is the page where I can find it. And it's all encapsulated in that one section. So the signal phrase of inline citation is used, usually it's one of the first examples that you'll use in writing and referencing someone in your paper as per APA guidelines. And what's important to note here is the format. If it's not a direct quote, sometimes you will see the same format, but without the page number. But for the purposes of this example, again, note that the the last name and year always go together. The second type of form is the parenthetical. And the parenthetical just simply means that all of the citation details are at the very end of the sentence. And you know that they're at the very end because they are completely surrounded by parentheses. So here you have, she stated, comma, and quotation marks. Students often had difficulty using APA style. And then you put your quotations followed by your parentheses and your citations in the middle with a period at the very end. In this case, Jones, the author, the year, and the page number. So when it's at the end, it's called a parenthetical. The point of this is just simply to highlight the fact that when you cite, you can cite in one of two ways, using a signal phrase or using a parenthetical. Both of these are acceptable forms of APA. But the examples that I have here are specifically for when you have a single author. We'll come back to that in a moment. But again, the one other thing that I'd like to point out here, and I'm just going to move my camera up here a little bit, is part of the reason why we're including the page number is because we are using a direct quote. But what happens when you paraphrase? What happens when you don't use a direct quote? Do you have to include a page number? The way that it usually works is that the APA manual will say that you should include it. It's nice to include it. You don't have to, but you should include it. So in the example below, where we just have a basic general idea, it's not a direct quote, this example just shows you that we have the user, excuse me, keep saying user, the author last name followed by the year and page number. And again, this is a parenthetical form. Although there's no direct quotes here, the point is if you include the page number, great. You don't have to. But it is recommended by the APA manual, and it's just going to save yourself a lot of time and trouble. And it's okay to do so. Now, you may see some publications where the page number is not listed at all, and that's okay, because in the past it wasn't required if you paraphrase the work. The rule used to be that if you are including a direct citation, aka a direct quote, you must include a page number. No ifs, no ands, no buts, no questions about it. But in the current manual, you're told you should include it, not you must. So keep in mind that you may see some inconsistencies in that in some of the published works that you'll be reading. So let's go through an example of what this would look like. I'm just going to move my camera so we can look at everything in its complete glory here. So here's an example where we have a statement that we want to include in our discussion board. Let's say Dr. Jimenez asked us to include our thoughts about, what do we think about distance learning in the discussion board post. And hey, here's this really great quote from this fictitious book called Distance Learning Foundations from Jimenez from 2020. Again, it's a fictitious book. And we have this following sentence that we found on page 24. Jimenez, we know that he describes distance learning as a fun and worthwhile experience. So let's say I want to include that in my post on the discussion board. Well, I can use a signal phrase. And again, what do I need to do when I create a signal phrase citation? First and foremost, I need to include the author, followed by, in parentheses, the year. I put my statement, what did the author say? What did they state? What did they do? And I have the direct quote, in this case, in parentheses, followed by, in parentheses, the page number with a period at the end. Oh, excuse me, it's the page number surrounded by parentheses with the page at the end. This is an example of a single phrase citation. But what if I was, simply referring to it, and let's say I had already quoted Jimenez a couple times, and I wanted to just simply give credit to the idea that he had. So using the guidelines in the 6th edition of the APA manual, we can just simply say that distance learning can be a fun experience for learners, followed by, in this case, in parentheses altogether, last name of the author, year, and page number. All this simply means is I'm giving credit to this author for this general idea. I'm letting the reader know I didn't come up with it, this author did. And that's, again, a way that you avoid plagiarism. So why is this important to understand? Because the rules change when you go from a single author to 2 authors to 3 or more, and it gets a little complicated. For our purposes and for our purposes only, I'm not going to, I mean, again, this is meant to be some brief videos on this topic, but the key message here is in the APA manual specifically, if you go to page, I have it bookmarked here, it's page 177 of the APA manual. You will see a grid like the one that you have on the current screen. And what it will tell you is what happens when you have a single author. So the first signal phrase that's used, and this is the format of how you would use it. How would you use it in subsequent phrases? But how does it appear the first time you use it in a parenthetical format? And how does it look like in subsequent parenthetical formats? As you can see, it's pretty consistent when you have a single author. And when you have a single when you have a single author, it's pretty easy, right? It gets a little bit more complicated as you start to increase the number of authors. For example, when you have two authors, when you're writing it as a signal phrase, right, you have to write the two authors with the word "and" in between if you're doing this as a signal phrase, right? So Smith and Jones, 2012, said that learning is fun, right? And you would do similar things if you use subsequent signal phrases. But when you look at the first parenthetical, if you were to use the parenthetical format, notice that you don't use the word "and," you use an ampersand, the "and" symbol instead. And the same thing happens with subsequent parentheticals. So you can use the ampersand only when you're dealing with parentheticals, not when you're dealing with signal phrases. And you'll see a similar role when you get to 3 to 5 authors versus 3 to 5 authors as a parenthetical. The difference is when you start to get into 3 authors or more, you start noticing that there's different rules, such as Smith et al. And what happens is when you get 6 authors or more, you see it again, Smith et al. Et al. Simply just means that there are other authors. What happens is when you use, when you have 3 or more authors, as a general rule, when you have 3 to 5 authors, you write all the authors' names out completely the first time that you mention them in your citation or paper. Excuse me, in your paper or in your post. Right? So in this case, we have 3 authors, Smith, Walker, and Jones, 2012. The next time that you're going to reference or mention them, you would simply just say Smith, which is the first author, et al. Right? So the first time, when you have 3 to 5 authors, the first time you mention them, you got to write them all out. The second time, and in all subsequent forms, you are going to simply just say et al. Same thing with the parentheticals. The first time you use it, notice there's an ampersand, not an and symbol, and then you have et al. When you have 6 or more authors, you just start off with the first author name and et al. So these are rules that you have to kind of look up and get familiar with. I mean, we could spend hours on this. My goal here is simply just to highlight the fact that there are different rules depending on the number of authors. So this is why if you already have a copy of the APA citation guide, I encourage you to keep it handy as you put together your discussion posts as well as your future projects. But I also encourage you to, if you don't have the book, look at the Purdue OWL, Purdue as in Purdue, the higher education institution. Some of you might know Purdue basketball. The point is the Purdue OWL is a great resource and summary for APA, and I encourage you to look at it so that you can get familiar with it. And again, in full transparency, there are times even I have to go back and review some of this because even I can't keep it all straight. But when in doubt, go back, look at these resources, and get familiar with citing. So in our next section, we're going to talk about some of the other elements that are found in an APA paper and some of the other additional formats that you should keep in mind when you are getting ready to write a post or put together a paper. Thanks again, everyone. We'll talk soon.